Hello, my name's Greg Jenner and I am a public historian. I work on the kids' TV show Horrible Histories, and I'm also the host of the BBC comedy podcast You're Dead to Me, where I put a top comedian in the room with a top historian and we have a lovely funny chat for 45 minutes about different types of history. But I'm also an author, and my brand new book is called Dead Famous, An Unexpected History of Celebrity from the Bronze Age to the Silver Screen. And it's all about celebrity, why we love it, why it's so powerful, but also where it starts. Because most of us would assume celebrity is modern, 20th century probably. But I argue in the book that actually it was created in the 1700s, and celebrity culture is 300 years old. And there are huge numbers of ways that celebrity has changed over the years, of course. The technology is always changing, and even in the 19th century you get the telegraph machine and steamships and radio and sound recording. These things all accelerate and increase the power of celebrity because you can get further afield. But the truth is that in the 1700s, celebrity was already up and running. And there are some great characters in the book from the early 1700s who, in every capacity, were celebs like modern celebs. People loved them, they bought souvenirs with their face on them, they named their babies after them, they hunted them down the street, there were stalkers, there was violence, there were Uber fans, there were anti-fans who booed them and, basically trolled them. They controlled their image, they tried to manipulate how people saw them, they put promotional stunts out there, they put stuff in the newspapers that wasn't true in order to get people to talk about them. They had feuds with other celebrities. They had affairs with other celebrities. They fell out. They had amazing sort of weird ways of dressing. They had pet lions and all sorts of things. In the 18th and 19th centuries, celebrities did all the things that modern celebs do. It's just that modern celebs have got Instagram and TikTok and Facebook and Twitter and all the other stuff. So the book is funny. It's entertaining, it's lively. The Guardian called it a joyous romp, which is very nice of them. The Observer was very nice too. The Daily Mail didn't love it, but to be honest, it's the Daily Mail, so I don't really care. But it's basically a history book that is very well researched. It took me 4 years, so about the same length it would take to do a PhD. But it's written for people who don't necessarily love history books. It's not intimidating. It's written in a style that is hopefully easy to read, even if you don't love big, chunky history books. So what else is in there? Well, we've got lots of different thematic chapters looking at the commerce of celebrity, how people made money, the history of sponsorship deals. There are celebrities in there like Clara the Rhino, who in the 1740s and 50s was a huge star. Quite literally, she was a 2-ton celebrity. She toured Europe like a rock star. She was an Indian rhino. There are also celebrities in there you will have heard of, like Lord Byron and Charles Dickens. Dickens made huge amounts of money by being a celebrity. And there are some in there you never would have heard of, like Cléo de Merode, who was a French ballerina who was famed for her beauty, but also for her ears. Weirdly enough, people obsessed about what her ears might be like because she used to hide them underneath long hair and a sort of Bondo hair, sort of hairband thing. And people would draw pictures in the newspapers of what they thought her ears were like. So pretty weird story. There are 125 celebs in the book in total, which is quite a lot. And I stop in 1950 because after 1950, you're going to start knowing a lot of the stuff that I would have talked about. You know Elvis and the Beatles and Marilyn Monroe. You know all that stuff. So the book is about 1700 to 1950. And I also look a bit about the Romans and the Greeks and what their idea of fame and glory was and how that's a bit different to celebrity. But anyway, in this video, I wanted to tell you about my personal favourite historical celebrity. His name was Edmund Kean, and he was both the greatest and worst human of the 19th century. I mean, that's a slight exaggeration, but he was brilliant, he was amazing, he was also an absolute bellend. A total douche. He was an actor. He was a brilliant Shakespearian actor. One of the great actors in the 19th century. Still to this day, one of the most influential actors, actually. If you go to drama school, you might still hear about him. He was a big deal, which is ironic because actually he was quite a small man. He was about 5'4". For a giant of acting, he was actually rather dinky. And that was part of his problem, actually. Edmund Kean was always small, and it gave him a real chip on his shoulder because he was never really allowed to be the leading man. He always had to play the kind of comedy roles, the pratfalling. He was very good at gymnastics. He could do front flips and back flips, and that's all the flips I know, in fairness. Cartwheels? Are those flips? Anyway, he was really good at all that stuff and slapstick and falling over and comedy stuff, but it made him really bitter because he wanted to be taken seriously. He wanted to be tall and handsome and elegant up the front doing Hamlet and King Lear, but he was over the side or around the back falling over doing somersaults. So Edmund Kean had a chip on his shoulder and it made him into a raging alcoholic. But I kind of feel for him. I mean, one of the reasons I love telling this story really is because that his childhood was quite sad. And so even though I know he was an absolute dick to pretty much everyone who loved him, I still sort of root for him. I still want him to succeed. I keep sort of going, come on, Edmund, you can do better than this. I believe in you. So his childhood was pretty sad. That, I think, is the first thing that got me. His dad tragically died by suicide when Edmund was very young. His mother, unfortunately, had to go into sex work in order to pay the bills, and she'd be absent for long stretches of time. He wasn't really raised by her. Instead, he was raised by his aunt and uncle, Charlotte and Moses Kean, and they were actors. So he was raised on the stage. As a kid, he was basically... wasn't really given a formal education, but he learned to act. He learned all the Shakespeare plays off by heart by being in them as a kid. And so he was put in all these plays, but often as the kind of clown role, doing the funny stuff. Gradually, he got more and more bitter. In his 20s, he marries. He marries a young woman called Mary, and she's Irish. She was clever and talented and funny. She basically had been raised in quite a good family, so she knew French and Latin and stuff like that, but she'd become an actress. Really annoyed her parents, actually. And they'd got married. She'd fallen in love with him, and it was a bit of a disaster because he's got no money, because he's a raging alcoholic. He spends all his money on booze. And one particular story is really extraordinary. He quits his job in Birmingham. He falls out with the manager. He's like, I don't need your job, don't need it. He quits the job. Turns out his next gig is in Swansea, which is in Wales, and he doesn't have enough money to get there. And so he basically makes his wife and him walk to Swansea from Birmingham. It's 180 miles, and she is 7 months pregnant, and it is summer. So, like, no donkey, no cart, no carriage, nothing. They are walking from Birmingham to Wales in the summer, 7 months pregnant, full on. And, you know, very little money for hotels. They're sleeping in ditches. It's absolute disaster. And when he gets to Swansea, you know, he soon gets fired from that gig as well, because he's this shambolic actor. He can't remember his lines half the time because he's always drunk. He ends up... I mean, it gets worse, to be honest. They have 2 kids, and they travel around the country, England, Wales, Scotland and Ireland, and they're touring, but he's always just hand-to-mouth existence. He gets to York, and they are literally starving on the streets. There's a woman who spots them and very generously gives them some money, enough money to get back to London. Without that, they probably would have died of starvation. So his life is just chaos. It's a disaster zone. And you're probably thinking, well, how on earth does this guy end up famous? How does he end up as a celebrity? Well, that is the story. That's what I love about Edmund Kean. It's a really weird story. So what happens is, in 1814, he goes from literally nobody to the most famous person in the kingdom in the space of a week. And what's happened is that he is down in Exeter, and while he's in Exeter, he's doing some performing. And I mean, he's been gigging for years. Let's just say that he's been gigging for years, but he's got this real drinking issue. In one of his plays, famously, he's playing King Charles I, and he doesn't really enjoy the play. He's not really enjoying it, and so he just vanishes off to the pub. And the play starts, and he's not there. And the acting sort of troupe around him are like, well, where's Edmund Kean? And he's not there. So the manager of the theatre has to go on in his place and do the lines, and he can't remember the lines. He's sort of reading the script out. It's rubbish. The audience start booing, and a few minutes into the play, the boos get louder and louder, and suddenly the voice calls out, "Keep going, lad! You're doing really well!" And everyone's like, well, who's that? And it turns out it was Edmund Kean. He had come in from the pub, hammered, totally drunk. He'd remembered he needed to be in the theatre, but he hadn't remembered he needed to be in the play. And so he'd climbed up into the royal box to watch his own play that he was meant to be in. And he starts cheering for the various other actors in the play, and then gradually he starts booing them and joining in with the boos. In the end, security have to drag him out of his own play. So that's Edmund Kean on a sort of good day. He got fired from that gig, obviously. So that's kind of the standard you could expect from Edmund Kean. But on this night in Exeter, Edmund Kean is really good. He's having a really, really good night. And someone in the audience is a retired headmaster who looks at him and goes, this guy's got something. He's a bit weird. He's a bit different looking. And it's true, he is. Edmund Kean, as well as being 5'4" and really dinky, has this really strange face. He's kind of funny looking. Not Steve Buscemi funny looking, but like I like to describe him as looking like a haunted owl. He's got these big, angry eyes. He's got this feathery hair, this very sharp, beak-like nose, and he just looks kind of furious all the time. And the mad eyes are the kind of thing that people talk about, actually. They say that that's the thing that makes him really, really distinctive. He's got quite a sharp voice as well. Not a very nice voice. It kind of rasps. And so he's small. He can do cartwheels. He's got a weird voice. He's got big eyes, weird nose. There's something strange about him. But anyway, this guy in Exeter is watching him act and thinking, he's good. I mean, he's weird. Furious owl guy, but, like, he's good. We should probably... I wonder if I should write a letter. So he writes a letter to the Drury Lane Theatre in London. Now, the Drury Lane Theatre in London, basically, there are 2 theatres in London that are allowed to stage proper plays. Only 2. One of them is the Covent Garden Theatre, which is doing really well. And the other is the Drury Lane Theatre, which has just burned down. And when they rebuild it, they spend way too much money on it. And the rebuild throws them into massive debt, and it's a disaster. And they open the doors, and no one comes. And they haven't got any stars. They haven't got any star actors. And this is a period in time, actually, where the word star is first being used to describe actors, actually. So they haven't got a star, and they're, like, drowning in debt. And they get this letter from the guy in Exeter, and he's like, I've just seen the weirdest man. He's like a tiny, furious owl. You should hire him. And so they're like, all right, I mean, we've tried everything else. Hasn't worked. I mean, it's the equivalent of, like, someone running a casino in Las Vegas and looking at Celine Dion and thinking, well, she's doing really well. I guess we should probably hire a busker or something. But they decide to do it anyway, and amazingly, it works. So Edmund Kean comes to London. There's a bit of a disaster, actually. He gets to London, and turns out there's a contractual dispute. He's meant to be in a different play from a different theatre, and that guy refuses to break the contract. So he's spending weeks waiting to get his big chance. He's waiting and waiting in the wings to sort of step on stage onto the Drury Lane Theatre, and he can't because he's still technically under contract with someone else. During that time, his child dies. It's incredibly sad. He and his wife are devastated. And also, he's hanging around the Drury Lane Theatre, and all the other actors there hate him. They absolutely loathe him. They're like, who is this guy? What, this weird little furious owl man? They call him the little man with the great capes because his clothes are too big for him because he's very small, and he wears these very big kind of capes, and he looks like a kind of like a gothic imp or a gargoyle in a medieval cathedral. He lurks in the shadows, scowling at them furiously because he wants to be in the play and he can't. And so they all ignore him and boo him and mock him and laugh about him, and he's getting furious. But finally, the contract is resolved, and he makes his debut in January 1814, and he does so playing the role of Shylock in The Merchant of Venice, one of Shakespeare's great plays. And he comes on stage, and there's a very small audience. It's January, it's snowing, it's cold, very few people have gone out of the town, into the theatre through the snow and the wind. It's not a good night to go and see the play, but a few people have gone, and he comes on stage, and he is amazing. He is, like, brilliant. Everyone else in the play is like, whoa, who's this guy? And everyone in the audience is like, holy crap, this guy's amazing. And he is furious and loud and roaring and whispering and lamenting, and he's hurling himself around the stage. He is basically method acting. Everyone else is standing there being very stiff and proper, and he is doing something really different. And they are all like, wow, okay, this is amazing. And the play hasn't even finished, and he runs out the back door, runs home to his wife, and he says, Mary, I've made it. I've done it. I'm going to be famous. And the reason he's going to be famous is in that night, in the audience, even though it's a tiny audience, there are 2 journalists. One of the journalists is a really famous writer called William Hazlitt, who loves Shakespeare and who loves what Edmund Kean has done. And he writes this incredible review. And so Edmund Kean is literally a nobody that no one has heard of, who very nearly dies in a ditch various stages on, like, one day of the week. By the end of the week, all of London is talking about him. Within 2 weeks, people are literally queuing outside the theatre to see him. They are breaking down the doors to see him. Too many people are trying to get into the theatre. They're fighting and squabbling. People are pulling pistols and all sorts to see this new superstar. Within a month, he's the most famous person in the kingdom, alongside maybe Lord Byron and the King or the Prince Regent. And Kean is now a superstar who has been a nobody for all his life. And you might be thinking, okay, great. So he's now kind of like feeling, relieved and excited to be heroic and great. And so he now decides, that he's going to become this great person in the world. And so you might be thinking, yeah, cool, okay, so he's now going to be cool and measured and chill because, he doesn't have to worry about money anymore, and he's not going to be an alcoholic anymore because he's finally achieved success. No. Edmund Kean is such a toxic arsehole. He immediately takes vengeance on everyone who has ever mocked him or ignored him or fired him or booed him. He founds a drinking club of all of his new friends, and he calls them the Wolves Drinking Club, and he brings them to all of the plays of his rivals, and he gets them to just boo throughout the entire play anyone who has ever at any point mocked him or ignored him or fired him. It's a lot of people. Boo! Boo! Loads of plays. He fires everyone in the play with him. Anyone who is a better actor than him, he fires them. Anyone who is better looking than him, he fires them. Anyone who's taller than him, he fires, which is most people. He surrounds himself with crap actors so that he stands out as the good actor, as the great actor. That's his strategy. His tactic is basically, I'm going to be the best thing in every play by surrounding myself with really bad actors. To the point that people sometimes would go to the theatre to watch Edmund Kean act because he was so amazing, but they wouldn't stay to the end because the play without him would be really crap. So Kean is a monster. He's a tyrant. Gradually he'll get worse and worse. I mean, later on, when he's running the theatre, 500 scripts come to him and he turns down every single one of them because other characters have good speeches and he's jealous of the other people getting a good speech. He's that kind of guy. He even, at one point, totally betrays his best friend, Thomas Grattan, who writes this play specifically for him. It's a very expensive play. It's about a Turkish sultan. There's really expensive props and costumes and all sorts. And Kean comes on and can't be asked to learn the words, and he just tanks the play on the first night, kills it overnight. He's like his best friend, destroyed by it. So he is awful. He's absolutely awful. But I kind of love him for it. I think it's really, really funny. He has these unbelievable feuds with other actors, constantly sort of getting them fired or trying to get his friends to boo them or refusing to work with them. He's such an arsehole. But he's a genius. He is amazing. He's absolutely brilliant. And he still has a drinking problem, I should point out, even though he's a superstar now. At one point, he's earning big money now. At one point, he goes into a pub at night, he gets really drunk. He ends up buying a yacht from a man in a pub, which, that's not great. I mean, we've all been offered a DVD in a pub, but he gets offered a yacht, and he's like, yeah, sure, great, why not? I'm Edmund Kean. And he goes home and wakes up with a terrible hangover, and there's a knock at the door, and it's the guy with the yacht. And he's like, sorry, who are you? And the man's like, I sold you a yacht last night. I've got it out the back. And Kean's like, right, yeah, I don't remember, but fair enough. And he turns to his wife, Mary, and says, Mary, have you ever wanted to live on a yacht? Because it turns out I've bought one. And Mary is like, no, we live in a really nice house. We're nowhere near the river. So why have you bought a yacht? And he's like, I don't know, I don't remember. So he has to pay the man to take the yacht back, which is classic Edmund Kean. He's a really interesting guy in that regard. The other thing I really like about him is that he's a working class kid who's done well, and he has a chip on his shoulder. He's also got a weirdly self-inflated ego, because even though he's kind of working class, he's grown up thinking that he might be the illegitimate love child of the Duke of Norfolk, who's incredibly powerful and rich. And the reason he's thinking this is because his aunt, who'd raised him, Charlotte, had briefly had an affair with the Duke of Norfolk. So in his head, he's like, well, my mum's not around. I've been raised by my aunt. Maybe she's not my real aunt. Maybe she's actually my mum, in which case my dad is the Duke of Norfolk. And that makes sense because I'm a genius. I must be aristocracy because I'm so brilliant. So he walks around telling everyone this story. And when he gets really famous and starts hanging out with really famous people like Lord Byron or whatever, he tells this story at dinner. And everyone's like, oh, I know the Duke of Norfolk, I'll tell him. And the story gets back to the Duke of Norfolk, and the Duke of Norfolk says, well, I mean, Edmund Kean's a brilliant actor, and if he were my son, I would be very proud of him, but I know where all my children are, unlike Boris Johnson, of course. So he's sort of telling these porky pies, these big fibs, and people are kind of going, all right, I guess, weird. The other thing that I love about him is he doesn't have a classical education. He was raised on the stage. His wife actually speaks French and Latin, and she's trying to teach him these languages, but he's not very good at it. And he would hang out with these really posh, rich, famous poets and writers and great musicians, and he hung out with, kings and princes. And he'd sit down at dinner and he'd be like, oh, I should probably give a speech. And so he'd stand up and he would try and do a speech in Latin or Greek. But he didn't speak Latin or Greek. But he would just give it a go. He would just improvise like a speech in Latin or Greek. And everyone else would be like, what's happening? And he'd be like, well, Latin and Greek, of course. And they'd be like, no, I mean, we all have classical educations. We can all speak Latin and Greek. And this isn't Latin or Greek. And he'd be like, yeah, well, of course, I would know it's Latin and Greek. I'm Edmund Kean. And then halfway through these speeches, he'd sit down and go, I don't even like these people anyway. These aren't my true friends. And he would leave mid-sentence and be found a week later comatose on the floor of a pub in some random bit of London. He'd go vanishing for days on end, sometimes 2 weeks at a time, and they'd find him in a pub or in a bush somewhere. His problem drinking did not get better. So he has this real weird thing where he, on the one hand, is kind of a working class kid. On the other hand, he really wants to belong. And then when he spends time with these really famous rich people, he suddenly realizes, I don't belong with these people. And then he, basically vanishes and people can't find him for a long time. One of the stories I really love is that he, at some point, is basically his friend bets him, I bet you can't jump out of a window, a high window on a second story. And he's like, I'm Edmund Kean, of course I can. And also, I used to do gymnastics, it'll be fine. So he jumps out the window and it is a bit higher than he realises. And he lands quite heavily. And an old man runs up to him and goes, oh my God, are you okay? And Edmund Kean, being Edmund Kean, he's a lovey, he can't help it. He immediately goes, aha, an audience. And he starts doing a death scene from Shakespeare. And the guy's like, oh my God, help, this man is dying. And he's like, oh my God, I'm dying, woe is me. And the man's desperately panicking and trying to get help. And Kean is having a lovely time doing the scene. And then after about a minute or so, Kean realises the man doesn't understand what's happening. He's like, do you not know who I am? And the man's like, no, are you all right? Are you dying? And Kean's like, no, I'm Edmund Kean. I'm the great Edmund Kean, the actor. And the man's like, I'm sorry, I don't go to the theatre. I'm a fisherman. My name's Old Bill. I don't really watch plays. And Kean at this stage, you might expect the arrogant monster that we know him to be. We might expect him to sort of get furious and outraged and offended, but he doesn't. He does something much lovelier. He jumps up. He's fine. He hasn't hurt himself. He giggles. He hands the man £5, which at the time is £1,000 probably. And he says, no worries, bye, and runs away. And I love that about him because that is Edmund Kean sort of as man of the people. He realises that not everyone knows who he is. So he could be a total diva and a total douche, but he could also be really quite a nice bloke. One of the things that's super important for you to know is Edmund Kean is one of the first ever celebrities to tour America. He does it twice, in fact, 1821 and 1825. And the first time he goes out there, he does really well. He makes a huge amount of money. It's very successful. I should point out, touring America at this time is really, really difficult. It takes 8 weeks to sail to America in a ship at the time. And when you get there, it's really difficult to get between cities because they're really far apart. And also audiences are quite small out there. The cities are much smaller than London and so forth. But he's one of the first ever to go out there and he does really well. But finally he gets to Boston and he alienates the people of Boston because not enough of them turn up. It's a bad time of year to go to the theatre and they're not going to the theatre. And so he turns up expecting people to come. He's like, I'm Edmund Kean, they'll come out for me. And they don't. And so he's really upset about it. And there's only like 50 people in the theatre and he refuses to go on. And he alienates the audience. And then he writes a letter in the newspaper to complain about Bostonians not supporting him. And that really pisses them off. And they are furious and they tell him to get out the country and never set foot again in Boston. So he goes back home. And he goes back home, and at this point he's got a pet lion that he walks around London with, and he's also been made an honorary member of the Huron Native American tribe. So he's wearing a feather headdress and a pet lion walking around London. So he's really showboating. But what happens now is he then gets caught in a huge scandalous affair, a sex scandal. He's always cheating on his wife with people in brothels and sex workers and whatever. But he now has an affair with his friend's wife. His friend is called Mr. Cox. The woman is called Charlotte Cox. Charlotte Cox is his wife's friend. He's having this really, really tempestuous affair. and it goes really badly, and all the love letters he'd sent her, she leaves them on the side of her dresser for her husband to find, to piss him off. And the husband finds them, reads them, gets a gun, and bursts into the room to shoot Edmund Kean. And Kean, luckily, is saved by someone jumping in and grabbing the gun. But the husband, Mr. Cox, sues him instead for essentially for cheating on him. It's called criminal conversation. It's the 18th century, 19th century phrase. He sues him and wins, and Kean has to pay him a massive amount of money. So it's a huge scandal. And it's not just a massive legal scandal. The love letters end up in the newspapers. So imagine like modern politicians when their sex get reported in the press and everyone can read what they've been sexting to each other. Same thing. Basically, you end up with Edmund Kean's love letters just going around, and people are mocking him. There are cartoons and satirical poems and everything. He has to get out the country because his wife hates him, everyone hates him, he's being booed in the streets. So he goes to America again. And in his head he's like, the Americans love me, this will be great, there'll be no problem at all. And he gets to America, and in New York they throw oranges at him because they're outraged that he thinks that Americans would love him, because of course last time in America they booed him, and also he's just had this huge sex scandal. They're like, why would we cheer you? We don't think sex scandals are good. But then he gets to Boston, where he'd been told to never set foot again. He gets on stage, and 5,000 people storm the theatre, smash down the doors, rip off the chandeliers, and try and kill him. It's an amazing story. People have paid money to watch him, but a mob bursts into the theatre to try and kill him, and he runs out the back of the theatre, throws down his wig, and he has to go and hide in a bloke's house around the corner in a linen basket. So these are his own fans who've tried to murder him. He's that level of toxic douche. He's such an arsehole. He also, at one point, tries to throttle his own son when his son says to him, "Dad, I'd quite like to be an actor as well." And he says, "The name Kean shall die with me," and strangles him. So this guy, Edmund Kean, one of the great actors in the 19th century, one of the most important pioneers, one of the titans of acting, incredibly famous, incredibly extraordinary. His story of becoming famous almost overnight is incredible, but he was awful. He was terrible. He was toxic. He was scandalous. He was problematic. He would have been cancelled 30 times over in modern Twitter times. But I love him because he's funny and amazing. And, there are so many paintings of him, and you could buy Edmund Kean statues and Edmund Kean souvenirs and engravings. There was all this commercial activity around him. People wrote poems about him, and they wrote letters about how amazing he was. But he was also a scandalous celebrity who cheated on his wife, toured America, had a pet lion. It's an amazing, amazing life. Someone should make a movie. I really hope they do. And if you do make a movie, please call me, because I'd love to work on that movie. So my book is called Dead Famous, Unexpected History of Celebrity. I don't know if you can see that yet. Great. It is funny, it's lively, 125 celebrities in here. It will change how you see the world. It will change how you see celebrity. It did for me too, actually. I changed my mind writing this book, researching it over 4 years. I started off thinking celebrity was kind of a bit naff and stupid and superficial, and I've really changed my mind. I think celebrity actually is very powerful. Sometimes a force for good, sometimes not, but I think it has a really significant influence on society. So if you want to know about Edmund Kean, if you want to know about the other 124 celebrities in the book, Dead Famous is available in hardback, on ebook, and also audiobook narrated by me, and it'll be out in paperback next year in 2021. So if that's the kind of thing you'd like to read, then give it a whirl. And if not, thank you very much for your time. Cheers. Bye.